Okay, welcome. My name is Lucan Wei. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, Munk School of Global Affairs, and co-director of the Petro Yasik program for the study of Ukraine. Welcome to this event. It's really hard to think of a war in which so many analysts have gotten so much so wrong. No one expected that Putin to mount a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And most assumed that any kind of invasion would primarily be a kind of hybrid war rather than a simple conventional war. Most spectacularly, of course, Putin himself vastly miscalculated the will of the Ukrainian army and population to resist. He expected the Ukraine to collapse. It did not. So here to make sense of this and tell you why they were always right from the very beginning and never mistaken, we have three experts. First, to tell us about the military affairs from Ukraine, we have Mykola Bielieskov. Mykola is a research fellow at the National Institute for Strategic Studies under President of Ukraine. He is a Ukrainian military and security expert. Next, we have two experts on cyber warfare. First, from Georgia, we have Nadiya Kostyuk, assistant professor of the School of Public Policy in the School of Cybersecurity and Privacy at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Her research focuses on security studies, modern warfare, cyber conflict, cyber institutions and capability, Russian and Eurasian politics. And finally, last but not least, we have our own Lennart Maschmeyer, who's a senior researcher at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, and the Center for Security Studies. Lennart's research examines the subversive nature of cyber power, focusing on its operational challenges and strategic limitations. He's also done a bunch of work, important work on cyber operations in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict since 2014. Okay, so to begin, I think I'm gonna start with you, Mykola. Can you just give us a sense, first of all, of the current state of the conflict right now, and from your position in Ukraine?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. And I want to start from the simple caveat that everything I said is my private opinion, not the position of National Institute for Strategic Studies or the office of the president we are working for. And talking about the current state, now we're in the second stage of this all-out war. Second stage compared with the first stage is characterized, first of all, with more limited goals set by Russians. So they are specifically concentrated on the east and south of Ukraine. And we are in a third week of this so-called big battle for the east, for the Donbass, where Russian main goal is to take full control of Donetsk and Lugansk region, and for it to provide the rationale for Putin regime to say that at least some mission was accomplished, more limited one, but at least some mission is done. But as you see, it's more than 2 weeks since both Ukraine and Russian authorities stated that this battle started, and you don't see this classical world was a second template when decides that on the offensive, that is able to quickly penetrate the defensive side defense and start this encirclement. So Russians were dreaming about this kind of encirclement, and there were a lot of maps, like the maps before the conflict that depicted these arrows with Russian strikes behind the convergent strikes along this joint forces operation grouping. But as you see, people, for the second time, they got the lesson that it's easy to paint these arrows, but it's difficult to project power, really to project. Because if you look at the map, Russians, they made only minor inroads, so just some tactical improvements of the situation. So they didn't breach our defense either on the front of the joint forces operation or on the flanks around Izum or Avdiivka. That's why basically also and this is despite the fact that Russians changed their tactics, because if you compare their tactics in the first stage of this war, where Russians attempted to do as much with this 200,000 grouping of forces, they changed the tactics. Now they are relying mostly on their superior firepower. They are constantly having reconnaissance UAVs in the sky, and they are relying on it to lob our defensive lines. Basically, they are returning to the template demonstrated by the Red Army in its attempt to breach the Finland so-called Mannerheim line, when they were successful in the end. But as you see, this superiority in firepower, it doesn't bring major results. Another reason why Russians are unsuccessful, of course, the fierceness of our defense. And I want to especially draw attention to this so-called active defense, because we are not passively waiting just Russians to outmaneuver us and outplay us in this massing of superior material and firepower. We are constantly attacking them, and we are relying first of all on the artillery. So we are striking them to the fullest possible range. So we are striking stockpiles of munitions, headquarters, a number of examples of headquarters being hit in the context of this battle. And also we are relying on the density of anti-tank guided missiles, both our own and provided by our Western partners. We're also actively targeting these reconnaissance UAVs. Russia using targeting them by manpads provided by the UK, US, Poland, and so on. And now we are in a stage of this kind of attrition warfare. So, and the major factor would be, of course, who would be successful in this counter-battery fight, where two artilleries are fighting. And that's why Ukraine is asking specifically about artillery, because in the first stage of the conflict, we complemented both Soviet artillery we have and anti-tank guided missiles of Western countries we will provide. But now we need the Western artillery. That's why we're asking for the tube artillery, for multiple launch rocket systems, for operational tactical missiles, and for counter-battery radars to be able to be successful in this counter-battery fight and to strike Russians in depth, to be able basically to replicate this airland battle doctrine, to be successful in thwarting Russian capabilities. And maybe the last point that everybody now is awaiting this Russian decision, where Russia would declare war, would put the country on a war footing, because basically, yes, it's a dilemma that Putin regime is facing, because either they are declaring this mobilization of men and material and have some new reserves, new formations to put into action, or they would need to switch strictly to the defensive mode along the front line, because again, everybody was reminded the lessons that we forget, that the tempo of exhausting resources in a protracted conflict with high intensity is huge. So this is the dilemma the Kremlin is facing, whether it would declare this mobilization or not. We are going to see. I don't think that it may happen maybe on the 9th of May, but it's really indeed a dilemma. But to be positive, at least we appreciate the change in the philosophy, in the rhetoric of our Western partners after the Ramstein conference, especially the statement made by the US Secretary of Defense, which stated that right here, right now, the end goal of the Western policy is not a kind of ceasefire, a season of hostilities at all costs, but the decreasing of the Russian military capability to the extent that it's not able to conventionally threaten both Ukraine and Europe. And just one thing, we want to see this rhetoric be complemented with real action. We appreciate that there is a change in armament provided from light anti-tank guided missiles, from manpads to more heavy equipment, but we need much more of it, and we're anticipating in the course of this battle where counter-battery fight would be the decisive factor.
Okay, thanks. Can you just articulate to me what practical differences there is in when Putin declares war? I mean, he's obviously been in war for a long time. It's not been a special military operation. I mean, is it the kind of, more sort of popular mobilization? I mean, what does that actually mean practically on Russia's side to declare war outside of rhetoric?
First of all, any actions that would be taken would bring result in the next 4 to 6 months. So even if people are called into arms, even if equipment is moved from the storage facilities, it would mean the new formations, yes, with older equipment, but new formations to at least to upkeep the level of fighting and so on. But in the end, when people are asking whether we fear it in Ukraine or not, in the end, of course, it won't happen in Russia if we are continuously provided with necessary level of Western support, because we need to remember that Russia created this army under favorable conditions, where it had access to Western technologies, where it has ample resources. Now these favorable conditions are no more or less, and I hope export control would be tight and Russia won't have this luxury of a lot of resources. So even if Russia would have some new formations in till the end of this year, it won't mean that it would change the tide of the war if we are provided with additional resources, especially artillery, because Russians won't be able to recreate the quality of the armies they have before this start of all-out war.
Great, thanks. So, I think one of the most striking things, and one of the reasons why so many people failed to predict Ukraine's response was a comparison with 2014, when the Ukrainian army, literally did nothing to resist the Crimean invasion and was embarrassed in the face of relatively, in the face of relatively small military forces in Donbass. Can you just sort of explain what is so different from the Ukrainian point of view, between 2014 and now? Why have the Ukrainians been so much more effective than they were just a few years before?
Well, you are right that in 2014 we have armed forces only on paper, and we didn't spend this time in vain. So yes, we have problems, we have a lack of funds, we have problems with utilization of funds, but we quantitatively and qualitatively improved. We increased the budget, we increased the tempo of training, we increased the maintenance of equipment, we start some modernization project, as you see the results like Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles hitting Moscow and so on. So I would say that our armed forces did their best under the constraints placed by them on politicians, because there are budget constraints, there are some political decisions made on the highest levels that are questionable, I would say. But despite all odds, these 8 years were not spent in vain. We enlarged army, so it's numerically bigger formation and it's better trained, better maintained. And I would say it's not overestimation to say that before 24th of February 2022, we have the best army in our 30 years of renewed statehood, best in terms of capabilities, in terms of training, in terms of readiness. And basically, I would say that armed forces, they, in the course of this war, they remedied a lot of mistakes that were made by the state policy in terms of preparing country for the war, in terms of investing in proper capabilities. So the whole miracle is about armed forces doing their job and gaining this precious time and doing the best against all odds. So that's to put it mildly, and to put it in a short sentence.
Right. I guess one question is about corruption. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion on Twitter and elsewhere that one of the problems the Russian military faces is extreme corruption. But of course, corruption is not, has occurred in Ukraine as well, right? And what's interesting is that, how the narrative before the war was very much on how corrupt, rightly or wrongly, how corrupt the Ukrainian state was. And it's funny how, to me, there clearly was corruption, how that's kind of, if there was corruption, it doesn't seem to have mattered. Or why, I guess, why haven't we seen that matter more on the Ukrainian side, given, if you look at the Kyiv Independent, which is a wonderful online journal, they still have a politics section, which has not been refreshed. And there's still stories there about bribes received by Sluzhba Narodov, this servant of the people, Zelensky's party. But just curious, why do you think that corruption doesn't seem, if it exists, it doesn't seem to really hurt the Ukrainian military?
Well, I would say I would put it in another way. There was some decisions in terms of what to purchase, at what amount to purchase that were questionable. So as for me, that is the major problem. Of course, there was instances and investigations where that funds were used properly. But I would say that these problems, they were ameliorated by the culture of transparency and culture of at least partial democratic control. So when even people in a Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, they understand that, well, if there is a problem, if there is a scandal, people would quick switch to mass media and so on. So this factor somehow, this transparency, this control of mass media, of opposition forces and so on, it somehow ameliorated the situation. So this is another example that despite all deficiencies in our system, democracy applied in the field of security and defense, it's the best thing compared with culture of secrecy and closeness that Russia is still observing under the Soviet tradition. I would say this somehow explains why, despite all difficulties, we manage that good. And another reason, of course, that despite the deficiencies, despite not the best decisions, another factor that greatly ameliorates the situation is a level of mobilization, not through the state, but through civic organizations, through the charity funds, and so on. They greatly complemented deficiencies as a result of the not the best, not the most sound policy decision. Because to put otherwise, I won't be honest. I would say that we did our best, but we certainly might have done better if more prudent decisions were made. But despite all these problems, democracy plus civil society, they ameliorated the problems and the difficulties created by some questionable state decisions in the field of security and defense.
Okay, just one final one, and then I'm going to get to the other panelists, don't worry. Now, you've spoken just now and also in other interviews about the importance of mass spontaneous mobilization in Ukraine. And clearly, I think we can all agree that, you know, what Putin really misunderestimated, I'm George Bush, misunderestimated, sorry, was a sort of degree of patriotism in Ukraine. But there's also been a lot of discussion of strategic errors made by the Russian state. Can you talk to me a little bit more about, in the early days especially, when we saw Zelensky encouraging people to make Molotov cocktails and distributing arms and such? I mean, I think this part I think at this stage, I was a little bit nervous because it felt like you had this massive Russian army, and then we had on the Ukraine side a bunch of Molotov cocktails, and, you know, it wasn't necessarily, but, you know, cause for optimism. But can you talk about sort of what kind of strategy or kind of military strategic decisions did the Ukrainian side make that you think helped or hurt the war effort? For example, I mean, like, you know, not defending the borders, but allowing them to bring in the Russian army and then surrounding them. It's sort of, I think we've heard a lot less about Ukrainian military strategy and much more about Russian military problems. So what kind of, can you talk to me about the Ukrainian military strategy?
Oh, well, if we are talking the first stage of the conflict and talking about the issue why Ukrainians in the end were successful and Russians are not successful, the simple answer that both Russians' miscalculations played, because there were a lot of Russian miscalculations in the process of planning this operation, in the process of creating the grouping, in the process of setting the aims. The most grave mistake done by Russians from just operational level of war, they tried to do a lot with a little. So 200,000 is very little for the aims they set for themselves in the first stage of the war. So when they were trying to project power in directions, and often not in a convergent but in divergent directions, like they were doing from the Crimea. So that's one of the major mistakes done by Russians. And of course, they, in my opinion, they really didn't have a plan except combining these paratrooper landings on the outskirts of Kiev with moving forces on the land and quickly turning down Ukrainian government and anticipating that everything else would crumble. So they, as for me, they didn't have sound planning either, except this paratrooper landings combined with moving on the ground through the Belarus. And another reason, of course, that we were conducting sound classical strategic defensive operations that, yes, allows trading space for time and not defending any bit of territory against all odds with all means available, but withdrawing with battles, but preserving forces and so on. So yes, why we were successful? Because Russians made a lot of mistakes, and we were just conducting the classical strategic defensive operation and also utilizing Russian very bad tactics when they were moving just armor, unsupported armor, and there were a lot of ambushes. We were basically utilizing the fact that, well, 200,000 people for this kind of front is too little. It's a fraction of the forces that was, for instance, employed in the Second World War for the same theater. So that's the answer. There were both Russians miscalculation, a lot of Russian miscalculation, and on the other hand, the sound strategic defensive operation, classical ones, when we traded space for time, but we preserved our forces.
Okay, great. It is puzzling to me. I'm assuming you don't have an answer unless you have an in with Putin. Why the Russians have never just tried to bomb the Kiev, the presidential administration in Kiev. I mean, I understand there's several attempts to capture Zelensky, but why haven't? I mean, I would have assumed that they would have, for symbolic purposes, have bombed Bankovaya, which is the presidential administration.
Well, the simple answer is that we have not that bad air defense system. Of course, it is relying on the Soviet surface-to-air missiles and fighters, but it's also one of the success stories that we reinstituted surface-to-air missile training on a large scale. We maintain fighters, and the Kiev is the most fortified in terms of air defense systems. And as you see, Russians were fearful of sending via piloted aviation. And in terms of lobbing missiles, well, Kiev has the biggest density of surface-to-air missiles, and we were quite successful in shooting down the Russian missiles. So that's, as for me, is the reason why Russians either tried, but were not successful, because we don't know for sure. But as I said, it's also one of the facets what we were doing for the last 8 years. We were maintaining better Soviet fighters. Pilots were flying longer, so they have more flight hours. And also since 2016, we reinstituted these large-scale exercises to prepare surface-to-air missile troops.
Okay, thank you. Nadiya, I'm going to turn to you. So just a few months ago, I think in late 2021, it was often assumed that we had sort of the era of conventional warfare was over, right? That we were in this era of hybrid warfare that relied much more extensively on cyber attacks, coordinated use of intelligence, psychological warfare, intimidation, bribery, and internet and media propaganda. But suddenly, in late February, we're back to World War II style tank battles. And so can you, it sort of feels very, a lot of this feels very kind of another era, almost. Can you, so how do you explain the sort of, is it true that there hasn't been cyber warfare? And if true, why?
Thank you so much for having me. I was so fascinating to listen to Mykola, so I was gonna totally yield my time and keep him talk. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. In terms of cyber warfare, you're absolutely right. At the beginning of the conflict, even prior to the invasion, we see a lot of talks that we should see full-fledged cyber war. And then a few weeks into the conflict, we've seen a lot of discussion why there hasn't been a lot of cyber warfare. So I just want to make sure we are clear when what we mean when we talk about lack of cyber warfare, right? So of course there has been a lack of visible cyber front. We all hear bits and pieces about various cyber operations. For instance, a lot of intelligence collections done with the Ukrainian cyber defense team, as well as with the US US, UK joint cyber warfare teams, right? We know that the US government has been sending its forces to conduct hunt forward operations, which basically allow them to operate on the Ukrainian networks to figure out various types of vulnerabilities, exploits, and then help them close them, etc. Also, they have been effectively engaged in terms of intelligence collections, again, on sort of Ukrainian, Russian networks, etc., etc. Of course, they are careful. Like we don't hear a lot of sort of full-fledged offensive operations by the Western governments, because of course this could be treated as a sign of escalation, but it doesn't mean that they are not doing much, right? And as you correctly pointed out, there has been a lot of information operations, which is again not sort of full-fledged destructive like Hollywood type of cyber campaigns, but there has been a lot of efforts to manipulate public opinion domestically in Russia, in Ukraine, as well as in the West. And I've seen actually a question in the chat about fake news. And again, we have to be clear here. There has been a lot of the similar efforts to boost patriotic moods among the Ukrainian population by the Ukrainian government, right? We've heard the stories about ghost pilot of Kiev, et cetera, right? So it has been a lot of stuff happening, but we have to be sort of clear when we talk about cyber warfare. I think the main sort of challenge here is that there's a lot of description about sort of destructive, full-fledged cyber warfare. And this is something that was mentioned in the Microsoft report, right? When we read it, you think, oh my God, there's so much stuff that's happening. There's a lot of destructions, a lot of this degradation. Yes, we've heard about some individual attacks. There's a lot of malware happening. We've heard about the attacks, DDoS attacks at the beginning of the conflict. We've heard about Vipergate, but the value of these operations were very strategic value were very limited. A lot of time we've seen that they were rushed, or they were minor, and they were not very well planned. And I think there are a lot of sort of reasons why this could be the case. But I think my major sort of explanations for this, like, and I'm curious to hear what Lennart has to say, is that Russia needs the internet, right? So we've heard about the stories when Russian soldiers, they rely on the internet to communicate. And then when the Ukrainian ISP providers, internet service providers, started cutting off their cell phones, they started grabbing Ukrainian soldiers' cell phones, right? I think they didn't plan this through. They need it for communicating with each other. They need it for intelligence collection because it's an important component, either to collect this intelligence to shape the potential battlefield events, or even to collect intelligence and plans to see how Ukrainian government and the Western partners are planning to react, right, about the next steps. So the internet is super, super important in this battle. And as well as they need the internet for information operations, right? So I think the key when we talk about, why this is full-fledged invasion and not the cyber war, is that we need to think about the objectives. What is the main objective of the Russian government, right? And it has been trying to prevent Ukraine from joining the EU. NATO for the last 8 years has been using some limited operations in the east of the country, and it has been doing some of the cyber attacks as well. But as Lennart, a great article in the International Security shows, hasn't been very successful. So I think like they realized that the tools that have been using to achieve their strategic objective wasn't very useful, and the military invasion was the way to go. And cyber plans a complementary role in this sense, but it's useful for sort of intelligence and information operations, but not for blowing up critical infrastructure per se.
So can you talk a little bit about sort of the learning curve? I mean, it occurs to me that perhaps one of the reasons why cyber warfare has played less of a role is that we are that both sides, neither side is as naive as they used to be in terms of phishing attacks and the like. I mean, to what extent do you think that's played a role?
Yeah, absolutely. So whenever I have a question about sort of like Russians' level of sophistication and tools and etc., and we've seen that Russia has been has executed a lot of like very sophisticated attacks, right? We know that Russia's hackers is one of the best in the world, but in some countries, again, from what we've seen in Ukraine, it hasn't been very effective. And I think it's sort of adjusts, right? So in the early stages of the conflict in 2014, we've seen some sort of minor cyber espionage campaign. There is something going on, but there was realization within the Putin's administration that information warfare was much more effective. And so there was a shift, right, in the strategy that Russia has been using. And this is, I think, the first time when we started hearing about sort of fake news and all of this various propaganda campaign. And as a result of that, the civil society in Ukraine is that they mobilize, and the groups like Stop Fake has been created, trying to parse through all of this information and tell people what's going on, that the Ukrainian government is not raping women, they're not crucifying babies, there are no Nazi representative in the Ukrainian government. It's just all a part of the Russian campaign, and the world has been, learning a bit about this. And so, as a result of it, Russian tactics have been switching. We've seen that there has been a lot of espionage happening as well, but also we've seen how the disinformation or propaganda campaigns have been shifted, right? So instead of like blaming just the Ukrainian government, there has been a lot of like anti-Western campaigns. So, for instance, prior to the conflict, prior to the invasion, what was interesting for me is that there were some news that says the roads in Ukraine are bad because the West, basically bad roads in Ukraine is the fault of the Western government, which for me is very funny. But there were a lot of like anti-Western messages trying to sway public opinion to make sure they are not supporting Ukraine joining NATO, Ukraine align itself, and doing it this way. So of course, they are adjusting, they are learning, they see what is working, what is not working. And it's all about cost-benefit calculation. In this way, blowing electric power grid is not effective, because if Russia plans to use the part of territory of Ukraine, it's better for Russia to keep some of the object of critical infrastructure actually intact. So it might be more useful to conduct intelligence, to conduct information operations to achieve the goals, and it will have less cost and higher benefit.
So I guess is what you're saying that Russia actually has more capacity than we've seen so far? I mean, is sort of, I mean, you obviously, I'm asking you to guess. I hate it when you ask me these questions. What's going on in Putin's head? I'm sort of asking you that question because I'm allowed to, because I'm a moderator.
Oh my God, I wish, right? I would be like, I don't know. I probably would be working for a different institution if I knew what's going on in his head.
But I guess what you're saying is at least possible, that Russia still has the capacity to do things like shut off the electricity grid, but it's just chosen not to. Or is that a question of capacity? I guess what would be your guess?
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought about that too, right? So there are all of this sort of explanation again in media that people saying, experts saying, we should still see something huge, right? It's holding off when there's a good moment, we should see it. And frankly speaking, like from what Mykola has been describing, and also from what we see at the first stage of the conflict, there have been a lot of really good moments that if Russia could have something, meaningful and could have used, it could have helped with the potential battlefield development. And they failed so badly. And they also demonstrated their lack of competency to some extent, right? Which doesn't make Putin look good. So I felt like, okay, what could be a better moment than we have when they invaded Kiev, when they were trying to get to Odessa, and now what they're doing in the east as well, next to Mariupol. So for me, it's that is like very unlikely case. More plausible explanation, I would say, is that they were not potentially playing. It seems to me that there was a problem of intelligence when it comes to Putin. It seems to me that he was misinformed in terms of like how much time it's going to take them, and what exactly is sort of going to be happening, right? The sort of expectation is like, oh, he's going to march on Kiev, everybody's going to welcome him, he's so great, and in 3 days he's going to get Ukraine. So I feel like there were not a lot of operations happening potentially. Basically, there were not a lot of cyber preparations done before the conflict, right? So in order for you to get in the network a system of strategic value, you need some time. And I think they haven't done it. So they could be doing it now. Potentially, we can see something bigger because they have now a little bit more time. So they might be like figuring out how cyber can help them. But to answer your questions, I really don't know. It's sort of speculation at this time.
Sure. So it sounds like what you're saying, that a lot of the problem, which is people have said in the military realm, was the planning for this war was very top down and in secret, and that sort of affected things like cyber warfare.
At least it seems like it. Yeah.
Okay. Lennart, can you sort of comment on this? I mean, why haven't we seen more of a kind of hybrid warfare and sort of cyber element?
Yeah, so I think, I don't know if this microphone works.
Yeah, it
sounds like it, right? So yeah, hi first, thanks all of you for coming and everyone's online. For me, for the same reason as Nadiya was just saying, that we fundamentally don't know the decision-making in the Kremlin especially. So in my research, I focused really on that question, on the conflict in Ukraine and trying to find an answer. And to me, the answer lies really at the operational level of how this kind of conflict works. But to explain why, I'll just take a little step back first, why we actually had these expectations about cyber war and escalation, because they, to me, were not that convincing at the time, because I think the whole narrative of cyber war and also of the use of cyber operations in Ukraine, if you read the media especially, has been quite far removed from what has actually happened on the ground. So right as the Russian military was amassing its troop at the border, you had all these predictions that there is going to be much more destructive and disruptive cyber activity, possibly escalation. And we would see capabilities used now, or at that time, at least, that were not previously used, because it's the first time cyber attacks, cyber operations are used in a major conventional war. And as Lukin just mentioned, that still holds now. There's still people making the same prediction. And so the underlying idea is this idea of cyber war, and also of cyber operations as instruments of war. And the associated idea, and I think that's really important to consider, is that states have these cyber capabilities basically lying around, that they're stockpiling to use in case of crisis or conflict, just like other types of weapons. But if you look at how these operations work, in practice, there aren't any capabilities that exist independently of a target. So right, if you have a missile, it has a specific explosive load, and that exists independently of what the target is. How much it destroys of a target obviously depends on how well protected that target is and so on. But cyber operations are fundamentally instruments of subversion. That's what I've been working on. And that means that rather than using force, as I said, we have an explosive load in missiles, for example, it's really about exploiting flaws in enemy systems and then manipulate these systems to produce effects. So it's not your own capability, your own missile that produces whatever damage and disruption, but it's systems that belong to your enemy already. And that means you depend on these systems, and you don't have capabilities without access to these systems and ability to manipulate them. So in theory, this mechanism promises a huge strategic advantage, because it's a way to weaken adversaries without going to war, and at lower risks and costs, because you don't have to deploy all of your own troops and military capabilities, material capabilities there. But in practice, this whole mechanism of exploiting targets involves significant challenges. It's hard to do, and these pose constraints that then limit the strategic value in practice. And I think this is really the mismatch in a lot of the expectations, because most focuses on what's theoretically possible, right? So we have more and more digitalization in societies. There are computers everywhere. So in theory, you can really cause a lot of havoc with these operations, but in practice, and that's also what we've seen, or if you look at the conflict in Ukraine or Russia's actions against Ukraine, the cyber operations, in practice, producing these effects is really hard, and it's also quite unreliable. So the point I'm making is that these operational constraints basically put you in front of, or produce a trilemma, where you have speed as a variable, then intensity of effects, and control over these effects and the systems you have. And because of the challenges involved, so I don't want to say too much in detail about that, but basically you have a base level of constraints, and you can only shift it around, but you can't increase all of these variables at once. So the faster you move, the less intensity you have, and the less control there is over effects. And that's precisely what we've seen in the operations now that Russia has used against Ukraine. But there is also, just in the expectation of more things happening, more destructive things happening, there is also, on the strategic level, a question why now would be the time for it. And Nadiya has already highlighted that, right? Russia has tried for 8 years now to subdue Ukraine and influence its foreign policy through different means, to hybrid warfare, the term that has become popular actually to describe this conflict, and has really failed to achieve its objectives. That's important to say, right? Very much contrary to all the hype around hybrid war in the last years, the expectation was that now with this new technology, it's possible for states to produce outcomes that were not possible previously. And that would actually mean that, as you said at the outset, we have a revolution basically in conflict. But Russia's action against Ukraine show precisely the opposite. They show the limits of these instruments, and cyber operations being a major part of these. And that's why on the strategic level, we see Russia has, apparently the Russian leadership has decided this doesn't work. So they use the traditional instrument, and that is warfare. So once that decision has been made, right, it's worth asking the question, why now use more powerful cyber capabilities, or try to produce more dangerous and disruptive effects through cyber operations when they already had 8 years to try all of this out and experimented with it? It does not really make sense strategically, especially if you think rationally, which we all hope someone does in the Kremlin at some stage at least. Once all these investments are made and all the material, the troops sent there, and the risk of escalation involved and repercussions from sending troops in, why wait and make all these investments and then use more powerful cyber operations? That does not really make sense. So there are, to me, both on the operational level and on the strategic level, without knowing the precise motivations, there are key reasons to not expect more escalation now.
Hey, can I just press you a little bit to be a little bit more specific in terms of why subversion hasn't worked? I mean, is it the fact that people aren't so naive as to press on that link that you get from someone who says you're a friend? I mean, what is it? Give me a little bit more about sort of why, on a concrete level, I mean, why subversion has. I'm thinking of, when I think of the reason why the Russians were able to steal, Democratic Party internal memos was because someone in the Obama administration pressed the wrong link. I mean, is it really that? I mean, is it that Ukrainians are just much more sophisticated and don't, press on that link, or what's going on?
So I think here it's good to use an example from before the invasion now. One of the Russian operations, this was really widely reported, especially in Western media, when they managed to knock out the power grid for a few hours in Western Ukraine. And that was really described as a next step in cyber war, because it exactly corresponds to these fears of a cyber Pearl Harbor and surprise attacks against critical infrastructure. And funny you mentioned the link, because that very operation, also keeping in mind this idea of capability, it started with an email that was sent from the server of a Portuguese university. And that email was about Ukraine's railway network and had an attachment, something about trains, basically. It had nothing to do with this target, which was an energy provider. And then someone at this energy provider was either, too fascinated with trains to be able to resist, or too bored, and clicked on this link. And that's gave these hackers access to the system, and they worked for around 19 months to learn how these power substations work and then manipulate them. So there are a lot of contingencies involved there and just learning. And on the other hand, though, from the perspective of, have the Ukrainians gotten better at defense? I think now that is possible. At that time, at least we see, especially in that example, that it was basically ideal conditions to disrupt the power grid, because the victims did not do anything. They had very bad protection. They actually discovered, that came out later, all of the affected energy providers discovered that they had been hacked, but did not do anything in response. We don't know why, probably because it's embarrassing. So the hackers really had ideal conditions. And even under these ideal conditions, they only managed to knock out the power for around 6 hours. And then the victims could just switch to manual control and completely lock them out, which also highlights the limits of control here. And now in the latest operations we've seen, so on the one hand, as Nadiya said, most of them have been really rushed, and we don't see any evidence that there was long-term strategic planning for any of them. So that, to me at least, explains why most of them have just not been very impactful. So most of it is really low-hanging fruit, like DDoS attacks. You can just basically do this at a moment's notice. You can even rent out these botnets you need for it. Same with these wiper attacks, which you just have to get into some system. You don't really need to do too much reconnaissance and just deploy them and they start deleting data and cause some disruption. But from also what we know, at least for example, the Whispergate operation that Microsoft reported in January, it sounds as if from the available evidence, they managed to delete or neutralize this virus before it could actually produce any effect. So again, really much more evidence of failure here. And then we also know that they tried again to hack the power grid and used the same code, the same malware that they had developed in 2016. There was a second time actually they hacked into the power grid then. And it was discovered because it was the same code, the same malware. That means it is known and then automatically detected if you have an antivirus program, for example. And again, it shows they did not spend any time developing these further or trying something else. Actually, it had less functionality than the one in 2016. So all the evidence that we have points towards, and Nadiya has already said that this is kind of rushed activity, not too much planning behind it, and accordingly, the possible effects you can create they are very limited, and also the likelihood that something goes wrong, as with the attack against the power grid, is extremely high because the less you know about your target, the more likely you're going to miss something that then leads to failure.
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit now about the regional element. So going back to you, both you, Mykola, and Nadiya. I guess thinking about subversion, Mykola. I think one of the striking things, if we look at sort of this conflict compared to 2014, is that the complete absence of any collaborators in the local Ukrainian governments. It's really striking. I'm sure, I can only assume that Putin was making, or the Russian government was making an active effort to get some kind of collaboration from not from the national government, from the local government to sort of seize, Kherson Republic or whatever, People's Republic. Do you have any thoughts on, why have the, been, why has the Ukrainian government been so successful in maintaining the loyalty of even officials in regions that were historically thought to be kind of Russophile in the Southeast? That's, remarkable. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I just have some kind of hypothesis, and the simple answer is that Russians provided us 8 years. So if we don't have these 8 years, not only to prepare militarily, because Ukraine of 2022 and Ukraine of 2014, it's qualitatively different countries. Different countries in terms of people's identity, how people perceive what it to be Ukrainian, and so on. That is basically the reason why Putin decided to employ a military instrument, because he saw that Ukraine was departing, Ukraine was fleeing to Europe, to NATO, and so on. He saw this, I would say, very deep changes in people's identity, in people's perception, and so on. So that's why he turned to military power, but it only made matters worse. So every time Putin is ramping up so he's making matters only worse. And as I said, it's 8 years, they changed Ukraine greatly. And really, in the Independence Square, there is a great banner that freedom is our religion. And the perception of liberty, how we place importance to the liberty, I would say it changed. That is the reason why we differ from Russians and so on. That's I would say that qualitatively different people, another Ukrainian identity, and again. Putin in 2014, he started the process of formation of separate Ukrainian nation, wholly separate from the Russian nation. And now it is completing the process of creating this political nation. I would say that peoples of all strides, of different political opinion, religion, ethnicity, and so on, they are fighting for their homes. That is, but again, it's my hypothesis because it's more about sociology and so on, and not a military affairs.
Right. Can you maybe talk, Mykola, a little bit about the role of sort of foreign assistance? I'm thinking of, you have, so when you read about sort of the number of different countries that are providing military equipment, 40, and Turkey, and at one level, it's very gratifying, and but also you think of what is it like to run an army with so many different systems of types of weapons, which probably each have their own different how-to manuals, and I'm just trying to imagine what it would be like, to kind of almost a kind of a lost and found kind of army. Is that sort of how do the Ukrainians? How different are the different weapon systems, and I guess how do they deal with such different systems?
Well, when the issue is about light equipment like anti-tank guided missiles or manpads, it's not a problem. So yes, we were provided with diverse systems, with diverse kind of anti-tank guided missiles, with diverse anti-tank grenade launchers and so on, but it's not the problem. So basically, we are grateful that we were quickly provided with it. So there was no need to fight with Molotov cocktail. So that's why it's not that big deal. The big deal, of course, when we were provided with heavy equipment, and yes, there is a plethora of, for instance, artillery systems that we either provided or at least countries are ready to provide. And yes, that it would also create problems, more problems, real problems, because different systems employed differently. There are some maintenance peculiarities, but again, it's not the major problem. The major problem, the major issue is with what to fight. So if we have the means with what to fight, everything else is secondary. Even with more sophisticated system like artillery, like missiles, and so on. So that was not the problem. That was not a big deal when the issue was with easily integrated system. Now it would create some problems, but again, as for Ukrainians, right here, right now, we need to solve the problems with what to fight. So we understand how to fight. I would say it's not an overestimation to say that Ukrainian soldiers are the best tacticians in the world right here, right now. But again, as I said, we know how to fight. We need to solve the issue with what to fight. And well, as for me, when I saw these reports that for Ukrainians it would take years, for instance, to integrate sophisticated things like missiles, well, it won't take years. It will take maybe weeks, months, and so on, but not years. Definitely not years, because you have this example why this whole issue with Neptune anti-ship cruise missile is important. It's not only about thinking of Moscow. The most important thing that we demonstrate is that we're not only capable of producing sophisticated equipment, we're also good at employing sophisticated equipment. So don't hesitate to provide us, for instance, with attacking missiles. We are constantly asking for to be able to wage this deep operation, so technological deep operation, and so on. So it's not the biggest problem. Of course, it's the issue to take into account, but when we have with what to fight, everything else is of secondary importance.
Thank you. Can you, I'm going to first of all open it up to anybody who wants, if you want to ask a question, please, stand up at there's a, yeah. Could you please stand up at the microphone, please?
Well, I was wondering if the success of the Ukrainians to repel the Russian forces might embolden them to go and recapture the Crimean Peninsula. Is there any political benefit to that? Would they ever wish to do that? That was my question.
It's a question for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, or not, yeah, if you want to take that also.
Yeah, it would be good.
Okay. No, do you want to ask?
No, I think you should start, and I'll follow your lead.
Well, with regards to the Crimea and parts of Donbass that were occupied since 2014-15, well, as for me, there is a change in perception among Ukrainians, among political elites, because in March of this year, there was discussions. For instance, political elites, they were more prone for some kind of compromise. But when people get to know what was going on in the suburbs of Kiev, and also the more conflict is going, more people are losing their comrades in arms. So there is a less readiness for compromise. And again, till the moment Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty is restored, international order is not fully functioning. So it's about restoring the basic premises the whole international order is based on. And yes, with statements and with this level of support committed recently, for sure, Ukraine can at least anticipate to exhaust or destroy this grouping of forces fully or to greater extent that was concentrated before the 24th of February 2022. Yes, we can do it. Of course, it depends on Putin whether he would call this mobilization and put the country on a war footing and so on. But with proper level, with of Western commitment, definitely Ukraine can win, and definitely Ukraine can recover both occupied Crimea and parts of the Donbas that were under occupation for the last 8 years. And again, it's, well, we can talk about economic rationale and so on, but first of all, it's about the principles world order is based on. So till the moment Ukraine is restored on the borders of 1991, the whole world order is put into question. So that's the major issue, the major thing to think about, basically.
Yeah, I wanted to add, but one thing that I wanted to add is more like giving a little spiel about my upcoming research is that obviously there was a lot of discussion about possibility of a peace deal and the importance of a referendum playing in any peace deal that could be discussed in the future. And so something I'm planning to conduct with a team of researchers in the upcoming few weeks, we're receiving funding for this, is to ask people, to ask basically public, to survey the Ukrainian population in Ukraine, as well as those displayed outside of the Ukrainian borders, about what they are, what the sort of outline of this future peace deal could look like. And the questions along Crimea and Donetsk and Donbass being part of Ukraine is on this as well. So maybe in the future you invite me again and I can present the results of this research and give you a little better answer.
Very interesting. So I'll get to you. I have another question, I guess, for Mykola. What role do you think sort of sanctions are playing in the weakening of the Russian war effort? I mean, I've heard sort of various inconsistent reports that tank production is down because you need chips from the West. I mean, at some point, are the Russians simply going to run out of missiles? I mean, in which case the war, like, I mean, is that too optimistic?
Well, when we're talking about the sanctions, I think we need to look at two issues. So there are sanctions in broad term. I mean, whether you have proper resources to finance the whole effort, and in more technical limited dimensions. So despite all export controls that was applied since 2014, we found a lot of instances where parts of Russian different kind of equipment were produced from the equipment procured in the West. So when we capture, for instance, Russian, the most ubiquitous reconnaissance UAV, it's Orlan 10. Everything except the plane. I mean, all electronics is imported one, either from the West or from Japan. The same is true with electronic warfare systems. Parts from the US equipment were found. Also, the famous example when the sighting equipment in the Russian main battle tanks was produced based on the technologies acquired in France. So if export control is strictly observed and applied, when people will scrupulously look on the import in Kazakhstan, Armenia, and so on, other countries, when they try to get these dual-use technologies, and if Russia is not allowed to import it through the third countries, definitely it won't be able to produce as sophisticated equipment as it has. So that's one of the major issues, strict export control. As to the terms of financing and funding and so on, well, before 24th of February 2022, Russia has the luxury both to spend on its defense in absolute terms 43 billion of dollars, just on military, not in a broader sector of security and defense, but just strictly on a military. With oil embargo, with energy embargo that is highly discussed in the EU, basically, and if it is applied properly, Russia would have the same dilemma the USSR government would have. So either you are financing war efforts or you're financing consuming power of your citizens. So yes, it would have effect, but as I said, when the issue of sanction is raised, there is a problem of sanctions. You need the time for them to be effective, but time in this context is gained at high cost. So first of all, when we are talking what we need from the West, it's about military equipment, it's about heavy weaponry, basically to buy time for sanctions to be effective. And yes, if they are applied both strictly in a technical field and in general in terms of economy, so Russia lacked funds, definitely Russia won't be able to recreate the same army that they launched this all-out war.
Someone sent me a linguistic map of Ukraine, and I'm looking at it. It shows Ukrainian majority in the northwest, center or Lviv, I mean, eastern Silesia and Polisia. So what is the response of the Russian-speaking population to the attack? Are they collaborating or are they fighting? And short, next question is about military strategy. Typically, military strategy says that you've got to commit 3 times the defending forces. That is about 260,000 times 3, about 800,000. But the Russians only committed 200,000. It shows to me that they are repeating the Cyrac successful strategy with Russian air and firepower, and the fighting being done by Syrians and Chechens and Hezbollah, 60,000 of them now. So what is the Ukrainian response to that?
Well, I want to start from the last part because it's closer to what I'm working on. Well, I agree with you that one of the mistakes Russians were doing, they were trying to do a lot with a little, because 200,000 is very little for the theater of operations they were conducting warfare, because in Second World War there were 4 Soviet fronts and millions of people involved in a territory when fighting was in the territory of Ukraine. And yes, I agree with your hypothesis that Russians might think that since they improved the mobility of their forces, since they improved the firepower, since they improved the intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, it would somehow compensate for the lack of manpower committed for this all-out war. But yes, we get another valuable lessons that the density of forces still matter. It's not only about technology, but it's about the classical density of forces, the same as it was in the First or Second World War. As to the first part of your question, again, it's more about sociology field, but you can find, if you try, a lot of instances where Russian-speaking people of the south of the east are fighting Russia as vociferously as Ukrainian-speaking people, and it's another proof that is political nation is forming, not a nation based on ethnicity and so on, but a strictly political nation. And the other thing that you would see that Russian language was already delegitimized in Ukraine, given the aggression that was started in 2014. Russian language would be delegitimized to the fullest possible extent in Ukraine. So again, this paradox of the Putin policy, more Putin is trying to preserve influence over Ukraine with his stupid policy applied and methods applied, the less influence Russia has, less vestiges of its influence are destroyed because of Russian stupid policy, because Russian language is basically delegitimized even further in Ukraine than before 2022 February 24th.
Thank you very much. We actually don't have time. Or do we have time? I think we're done. Sorry, he's my boss. He told me I do whatever Lennart says. Okay, so thank you very much. It was a very stimulating conversation. Thank you especially to Mykola and Ukraine. Keep up the good work, fight the fight. And to Nadiya in Georgia and Lennart here. Thank you very much for this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for having us.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.